Hi, I'm Camilla, wine educator here at Corney & Barrow. In this video, I'm going to explain some of the important steps of how to taste wine. If you have some wine samples to taste along with me, that would be great, and I'll be making reference to those if I go along, but I hope you'll find that this video is useful even if you don't. When we taste wine, we use three different things: our eyes, nose and mouth. Your eyes will really only tell you simple things such as the colour of the wine. But when you pour a glass of wine, the first thing that you should check is the clarity. And what do I mean by that? Well, the wine should be clear rather than cloudy and bright rather than dull. And you don't want to see any bits floating around in it. People often talk about the legs or tears on a glass. If you're not sure what I mean, take any of your wine samples and swirl the wine around in the glass and watch as the liquid forms slow drooping marks down the side of the glass. Some people mistakenly think that this is to do with the quality of the wine, but actually all the legs or tears are just an indication of alcohol. And of course the easiest way to check the alcohol content is to look at the label, as it has to be printed on there by law. Contrary to what you might think, when you eat or drink something, you don't actually detect too much in the way of flavours in your mouth. Instead, you'll notice things like salt and temperature. More specifically relating to wine, your mouth will tell you about the acidity, tannins, sugar, alcohol and body. I'll come back to this in just a moment, but first to explain the importance about your nose when it comes to tasting wine. Your nose can detect thousands of different aromas, and your nose tells your brain what you are actually tasting. The aromas travel up the nose when we take a good sniff of the wine, and also down the throat and back up into the nose when we are eating or drinking. You may have noticed before, when you've had a cold and your nose is blocked, that you don't taste your food and drink as well as you normally do, and this is why. One thing people may find intimidating about wine tasting is describing the aromas and flavours in the wine. Really, it's all down to practice, and the more wine you taste, the easier you will find to notice and identify the differences between them. In time, you could put together a huge vocabulary to describe wine, but it's also important to remember that sometimes it isn't very helpful if you are trying to recommend a wine to someone. Firstly, that's because it's very subjective, and so what I smell in the wine as strawberry, you might think smells more like raspberry. Secondly, it's only useful to describe something or smelling of, say, gooseberries, if your audience actually knows what they smell like. And finally, if you use descriptions that someone doesn't like, it's very easy to put them off a wine that they might otherwise enjoy. If you feel less confident at describing wines, or if you want to make better recommendations, it can be often easier to group aromas into categories. So, for example, rather than strawberry, you might say red fruits, or instead of pineapple, you might say tropical fruits. I mentioned some of the things you use your mouth to detect in wine, and I'm going to explain these in more detail now. I'll start with acidity. Acidity causes you to salivate. To see what I mean, I would like you to take glass number 1. Take a mouthful, swirl the wine around your mouth, swallow, and then leave your mouth open. You should notice now that your mouth will be filling up with water, and this is the effect of the acidity. The more your mouth waters, and the more it persists in doing so, the higher the level of acidity is in the wine. If the wine that you are tasting has high levels of acidity, your mouth is probably still watering now. Acidity is important because it keeps the wine refreshing by cleansing the mouth. And it's also useful when looking to recommend a wine, for example, on a sunny afternoon or when food pairing. Acidity comes from the juice of the grape. If you want a wine with good acidity, the best trick is to look for a wine from a cool climate. Grapes grown in cooler conditions tend to have high levels of acidity. This is all down to how grapes ripen. Over time, the acidity levels go down and the sugar levels go up. In a cooler climate, the grapes aren't able to ripen as much, so you tend to find that they have higher levels of acidity. Whereas in a warmer climate, the grapes can ripen for a longer period, so the acidity levels tend to be lower. Sugar and sweetness can be a confusing part of wine because there seems to be two ways that we can talk about it. In the wine world, we are talking about the actual measure of sugar that is in the wine. Remember I said that as the grapes ripen, the sugar levels increase. Well, it's the sugar that turns into alcohol during the fermentation process. For most wines, all the sugar gets turned into alcohol, so most of the wines that we drink are what we call dry. This can be different to how consumers talk about wine, and I think this is because our brains confuse us. What I mean is that when we eat fruit, we eat sugar. So when we smell or taste a wine that is very fruity, our brains automatically assume that we are consuming sugar. So often, the fruitier the wine is, the sweeter that somebody will want to describe it as being. If you are tasting along, I'd like you to have another taste of glass number 1. Then compare it with wine number 2. You should notice that both are very fruity, but only the second wine has a little bit of sugar left in the wine. If you're not convinced, go ahead and retaste wine number 1, and you'll see just how dry it now seems. In fact, you might even find it unpleasant. I'm going to talk about tannins now, and for this you'll need wine number 3. Tannins have almost the opposite effect to acidity, a drying sensation. To see this, take a mouthful of wine, swirl it around your mouth, and this time once you swallow, run your tongue around your teeth and gums. You should notice a rough, grippy drying effect. That's caused by the tannins. The more you notice this sensation, the higher the tannin levels are in the wine. We all have different levels of sensitivity to this. And I usually find that if people don't like red wine in general, or they don't like a particular red wine, it's often the tannins that are the problem. If you don't like tannin, you might describe it as having a bitter taste and wonder why they are found in wine. Tannins come from the skins of the grape, which is why we only really talk about them in relation to red wines. The reason for this is all to do with how wine is made. If you take a grape, regardless of the colour of the skin, the juice and flesh inside are always clear. With white winemaking, we normally take white grapes, crush them up and discard the skins. You then use your clear juice to make clear or white wine. With red grapes, if you crush up the grapes and discard the skins, you will also have clear juice, which you can use to make white wine. In reality, apart from the sparkling wines of the world, this isn't really a common practice. To get the colour that we find in red and rosé wines, we need to leave the juice sitting with the skins for a period of time. This will extract the colour, and in the case of red wines, also the tannins. It's exactly the same for rosé wine, except that the period of time is a lot shorter, and that's why we get a paler colour and we don't really have any noticeable tannin. It might be useful to think about making tea, as tea also has tannins in it, so you'll notice that same drying sensation in both tea and red wine. But it's also useful for thinking about tea when it comes to winemaking. If you imagine quickly dunking a tea bag into a cup of hot water, just for a short period of time, you'll get a little bit of colour and a little bit of tannin. If you leave the bag in the cup for a much longer period of time, you'll have a lot more colour and a lot more tannin. The body of the wine is all about how the wine feels in your mouth. Here it can be useful to think about the difference between water, milk, and then cream. The difference of how these feel in the mouth mirrors light, medium and full-bodied wines. This is very useful when thinking about food pairing, as in general it is best to pair lighter food with lighter bodied wines, and vice versa. Lastly, I'm going to talk about alcohol. The alcohol levels in most wines sit between somewhere like 12 and 14%. So actually the difference between different wines isn't always that noticeable. But the alcohol contributes to the overall body and the overall mouthfeel of the wine, and it is usually detected as a warming glow towards the back of the throat. The more warming the wine is, the higher the alcohol level is. So when it comes to tasting, you need to use a combination of your senses to get the most enjoyment out of wine.